Hello, I'm Michael Weisenburg with the University of South Carolina, and this afternoon I will be talking about alternative epistemologies in Mark Catesby's natural history. Mark Catesby first came to the Americas in 1712 at the age of 29. He accompanied his sister Elizabeth on her transatlantic voyage to join her husband in Virginia. He lived in the British colony for 7 years, and as he later wrote, quote, "I chiefly gratified my inclination in observing and admiring the various productions of those countries." He spent time with prominent colonists such as William Byrd, experimented with gardening, and made sketches of what he saw from nature. In 1714, he traveled to the headwaters of the James River in the Appalachian Mountains and made a trip to Bermuda and Jamaica. During this time, he corresponded with naturalists, and upon returning to England in 1719, various members of the Royal Society became aware of and were impressed with his drawings of wildlife. With the encouragement and support of William Sherard, Hans Sloane, and others, Catesby returned to the British American colonies for a second extended stay in 1722. He was based out of Charleston, South Carolina during this second sojourn and collected specimens of plants and animals for further study back in the metropolis. In this respect, Catesby was among a number of transatlantic British naturalists who labored to describe the New World for an avid and curious European readership. His initial work was firmly rooted in the empiricist convictions of Enlightenment science, and like his contemporaries John Lawson and John and William Bartram, he was devoted to making direct observations of nature from the field. He was among the earliest English naturalists to systematically describe and catalog the indigenous flora and fauna of the southern colonies of British North America. For this work, Catesby and his influence on subsequent natural historians is firmly established. After returning to England, Catesby spent nearly 20 years writing and engraving his natural history of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands, which was published by subscription and in installments. Catesby's work was innovative in both its style and substance. The 220 hand-colored engravings often strive to illustrate environmental relationships, and the corollary text describe not merely the plants and animals illustrated, but also cultural and ethnographic information about the colonies, the indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and plantation culture. Amy Myers has argued that Catesby's distinctive pictorial and linguistic techniques comprise a, quote, visual system to express environmental relationship, and in particular for examining, quote, the ways in which newly introduced organisms from around the globe were changing existing patterns of organic interaction. Indeed, in his letters and his book, Catesby is attuned to an increasingly interconnected world of transatlantic flux. Additionally, Christopher Iannani points out more broadly that, quote, printed natural histories of the colonies provided a form of epistemological training for metropolitan and colonial readers as subjects of a new commercial empire. As such, Catesby's natural history was just as much a work of colonial promotional literature as it was a scientific document. In this brief presentation, I wish to focus on this vibrant, interconnected world of which Catesby was a part. In considering the colonial context of how Catesby communicates and publishes his observations, I want to also reconsider Catesby's natural history through a decolonizing lens that works to recover the work of indigenous and enslaved peoples in order to better understand how Catesby relied on their worldviews and knowledge systems to better describe the natural world. While Catesby's depictions of indigenous people of North America and displaced enslaved Africans have been discussed, what is less studied is his engagement with Native American and African knowledge of the natural world. This is best exemplified in his account of the description of the, quote, grinders of an elephant, which appears immediately after his speculations on how the deluge affected the terrain and geology of North America. Catesby recounts that, quote, at a place in South Carolina called Stono, was dug out of the earth 3 or 4 teeth of a large animal, which, by the concurring opinion of all of the native Africans that saw them, were the grinders of an elephant. These discoveries are likely the first recorded instances of mammoth fossils in North America. And while Catesby does not name the enslaved persons who discovered them, his reliance on their knowledge of elephants situates them as corroborators in his scientific endeavors and illustrates his openness to the validity of their interpretation of empirical evidence. Though sporadic, Catesby's occasional deference to African and Native American knowledge brings into relief both a global network of natural history and a cross-cultural reliance on identification and interpretation that was a result of various colonial enterprises. Situated within Catesby's contemplation about the nature of geologic anomalies, his deference to African knowledge reveals both Catesby's acceptance that the landscape and its environment changed, as well as a recognition that other cultures might have insight he lacks. The incident of the elephant grinders shows Catesby accepting these various viewpoints, that he might better see the North American continent as it was, rather than what promotional literature of the period wanted it to be, and registers his work to be an antecedent to our contemporary concerns regarding conservation and the preservation of species. Additionally, Catesby's ethnographic work and his use of African and indigenous knowledge as a source of authority allows us to recover the role of diverse peoples in the writing of natural history and to reconsider other, sometimes competing, generic and ideological forces at play within such texts. Catesby's use of indirect reporting from colonial, indigenous, and enslaved sources is in part a result of what Susanna Hurley has described as, quote, the tremendous ethnic diversity of the British colonies. In addition to the many Native American tribes, there was a broad range of people from different African ethnic groups, as well as European settler colonists. Kovacic and Winberry estimate that about 60% of the population of Charleston was from Africa, and Hall points out that many enslaved people brought with them foodstuffs such as bene, okra, and yams, as well as their agricultural knowledge of rice production. All of these people brought with them their customs and languages, and many of them brought botanical resources and other materials, leading to rapid changes in both the culture and environment of the region. Just as much as it was changing the ecology of the region, this creolization of the Carolinas was rapidly creating a nexus of communication in which transformation was simultaneously a marker of community and belonging, as well as a commodity of intercultural discourse. Susan Scott Parrish has described it, quote, more than in other places, extending curiosity in America meant relying on other people's alternative knowledge practices, which in turn produced, quote, vexed chains of communication that forced more open-minded and intrepid colonial explorers to experience, quote, the loss and extension of their prior epistemologies. While these colonial meetings and transformations occurred in a variety of circumstances, naturalists with firsthand experience in the colonies were in a unique position to communicate with many people from diverse backgrounds. And the natural histories they wrote document not only what they saw, but how they saw it and who they saw it with. It matters that Catesby saw the mammoth fossils not at the Royal Society or in Hans Sloane's Cabinet of Curiosities, but in the field, on a plantation, in the presence of enslaved Africans. And it matters that he references them and their opinions in his texts. These facts matter because they are evidence that people other than white settler colonists were engaged in inquiries about the natural world and that Catesby valued their knowledge. Mark Catesby was, of course, not the only European naturalist working with diverse peoples in the colonies, nor is it as simple as arguing that Catesby valued the opinions of enslaved and indigenous peoples. Others, such as Maria Sylvia Marion and John Lawson, were engaged in naturalist pursuits, and they, along with Catesby, were part of and complicit in colonial structures of oppression. Maria Sylvia Marion provides a useful comparison to Catesby in that she too relies on indigenous and enslaved knowledge. However, her references tend to be more focused on labor and consumption rather than on knowledge systems per se. Etheridge and Peters argue that, quote, between her own observations and what she gleaned from her local sources, Marion built up a vivid picture of the teeming life of the Suriname jungle, and that much of the information on the use of plants was obtained from slaves on the sugar plantations where she stayed or from indigenous people who had helped her collect specimens. They point out that her Metamorphosis Insectorium Surinamesium, she often acknowledged the role of slaves and, quote, her Indian. Marion's use of the possessive illustrates the paternalistic hierarchy in which she understood her relationship with the indigenous people of Suriname, and the half-dozen or so references to native and enslaved people in her work situate them in service to her, in the use of tubers as foodstuff, and the use of Flos pavonis, or the peacock flower, as an abortifacient to protect unborn children from enslavement. Similarly, we know that Catesby owned at least one slave during his time in the colonies. As such, both Catesby and Marion are complicit in the power dynamics of colonization and empire. This is by no means to anachronistically deride Marion or Catesby, but rather to accurately situate their use of indigenous and enslaved knowledge within the greater colonial power dynamics of which they were a part. Marion's attention to the domestic and medicinal properties of plants is in keeping with many colonial authors, and her description of the peacock flower speaks to the horrors of slavery. Ultimately, the differences between the two is in part an issue of the competing styles and scopes of each author's projects. Still, Catesby is far more explicit in explaining how he both relies on and respects the knowledge and skills of marginalized and subjugated people. As Parrish has argued, the work of natural history was used as, quote, an imperial alibi in all sorts of ways. And, quote, botanists and explorers such as Bartram, Catesby, Lawson, and others not only taxonomized the local flora and fauna, but also mapped the territory and thereby laid possession to the land in the name of British Empire, thus furthering the colonial project. Conversely, enslaved Africans in turn, quote, needed to manipulate every advantage they could for some modicum of agency within plantation society, and thus frequently provided testimonies about the natural world. And herein lay the crux of natural curiosity. Capacious in terms of epistemologies, yet still reliant on racialized dynamics of colonization and slavery, Catesby, Marion, and others are complicit in the colonizing project and the beneficiaries of the heterogeneous worldview that the emergent and changing social dynamics of the colonies provide. In addition to referencing the knowledge and practices of enslaved peoples in his letters and natural history, Catesby also writes extensively about his encounters with Native Americans, and is largely admiring and respectful in his descriptions. He writes of their friendliness, his reliance on them for assistance as trail guides and in assisting in his labors, and additionally, it is clear that he greatly valued their knowledge of the region's flora and fauna, and he often references them as authorities. Henrietta McBurney argues that, quote, for Catesby, it was important to cultivate the indigenous peoples both for reasons of self-preservation and to act as his guides, as well as for what he could learn from them of their uses of plants and animals. To this end, Catesby learned native names for plants and animals, as well as basic vocabulary and phrases. With reference to the high value he gave to native knowledge, Parrish writes, quote, Catesby in particular recorded numerous instances of his use of native informants, and that, quote, nowhere did Catesby disparage Indian testimony or record a white informant who gave him contradictory evidence. It is important to note that Catesby valued indigenous opinions and reports higher than those of white settler colonists insofar as it shows his willingness to accept other cultures' value systems in his presentation of natural history to a European audience. There are many instances of Catesby referencing and deferring to native knowledge. However, in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on several competing accounts of snake root found in his writings. In addition to the pure pursuit of knowledge and a genuine interest in the natural world for its own sake, Catesby, like many colonial explorer naturalists, was invested in learning about consumable and medicinal plants that might be cultivated and commodified. This commercial interest in nature often leads Catesby to encourage the adoption of native and African knowledge to both better understand the natural world and better exploit its resources. A common theme that occurs throughout his letters is the question of which species qualify as snake root and what effect they may have on curing snake bites. In a letter to William Sherrard dated 16 January 1724, Catesby dismisses the opinions of William Byrd of Westover, a friend and correspondent of Catesby's and one of the wealthiest and most influential British colonials at the time. He writes, quote, I remember to have heard Mr. Byrd commend it, but amongst the Indians it is not in great esteem. That which is in most repute among the Indians is a plant not unlike plantain, but with a tuberous root. This is just one of many examples of which Catesby both discusses possible candidates for snakeroot and which he sides with the opinion of indigenous knowledge. In another letter, Catesby recounts that most Native Americans understand that a snakebite means certain death, and while he hedges from giving any definitive opinion of his own, his remarks are almost always that of skepticism regarding colonists' desire to find a botanical cure. The example of snakeroot fits within a persistent interest in consumable plants and their relationship to both the broader ecosystem of the region and the development of colonial plantation culture, as is exemplified in his writings and illustrations of yarrow, cocoa, sweet potato, cashews, and other plants. Iannini argues that, quote, by training his powers of observation on new organic interrelationships in Carolina during its rapid transition to plantation agriculture, Catesby charts the incorporation of the colony into the greater Caribbean, and that his natural history, quote, confronts the interrelated problems of epistemology, environmental transformation, and finance capital. The engravings with accompanying descriptions and by focusing in many cases on complex interconnections between recently introduced species, along with the various people who came in contact with these species, allow Catesby to write his natural history in a manner that, quote, met the demands of a readership hungry for timely intelligence from the colonies to document, interpret, and improve them for financial gain and scientific progress. The role of Native Americans and enslaved Africans in exploration, promotional tracts, and scientific literature can be used as a means of decolonizing the history of natural history, and Catesby's work is one of several rich documents out of which we might recover the intellectual labor of traditionally underrepresented groups. We might even go so far as to consider them participants in Catesby's natural history. Gilmore and Eschbauer have advocated for, quote, rethinking the relationship of informant with the more equitable and respectful title of participant in order to, quote, replace hierarchies with relationships of collaboration and co-production of knowledge. More recently, McAlvey, Armstrong et al. Have argued that, quote, scholars and practitioners must actively challenge colonialism, racism, and oppressive structures embedded within their institutions, projects, and themselves. By acknowledging the validity of diverse knowledge systems and recognizing them when we find them in historical documents, we are better able to fully respect the broad epistemological perspectives that allowed the natural histories we have traditionally revered to exist in the matter in which we have received them. To fully do so, we must consider Catesby at the intersection of several epistemological viewpoints and situate him across an array of methodological lenses of transnational, global, and natural history, and understand him as engaging with the common histories of colonization, diaspora, and migration. Patrick Manning points out that, quote, studies of imperialism produced in the era of decolonization offer implications for the history of science, and that, quote, the study of science in colonial territories affords a balance between a developing system of principled scientific knowledge and a world that operated through eclectic systems of practical or inherited knowledge. Catesby is in the midst of all of these developing and interconnected knowledge systems, behaving as what Andreas Hoefel and Werner von Kopfenfels refer to as colonial go-betweens, who collected and interpreted and transmitted information through what Markup Jacob describes as a network of, quote, linked visions of science, empire, and emergent global capitalism. In reading the natural history of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands with an eye towards Catesby's participants, we are better able to recover the role indigenous and enslaved people had in contributing and developing imperial epistemologies and in the writing of natural history. And here is a quick slide of very abbreviated works cited of different scholars I've quoted in this talk. And I want to thank you very much.